Welcome everyone to New South Wales DPI Dairy webinar number 19, Extension Services Supporting Dairy Farms Using AMS, the Irish Example. My name is Nicholas Lyons. I'm the leader dairy for New South Wales DPI, and I'll currently be facilitating this presentation today. Let me introduce our guest speaker tonight here. Mr. Philip Kennedy holds a Master of Agricultural Science with a focus on agricultural innovation and support. He did his research master's through the Walsh Fellowship Program with Teagasc and the University College Dublin, looking at current extension services available to AMS farmers and how much the farmers utilize these services. Currently, Philip is Farm Management Support Advisor with Lely Centre Mullingburgh in Ireland, and he'll be your presenter today. I bumped into Philip's master thesis some time ago, and I found it was a great work, and it had a lot of great information, and therefore I invited Philip to share some of his insights with us here today. I do want to thank Philip for his time, first of all, and also thank you all for joining. So, Philip, I'll share presentation rights with you now, and you should be able to pull up your screen.
Perfect. Can you see that, Nico?
Perfect. So the stage is yours.
Yep, super. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. As Nico says, my name is Philip Kennedy, and the reason I'm talking to you this evening is just in relation to my study, which was a Master's in Agricultural Innovation Support. So basically just a small bit on myself and really what the basis for the study is. One second. Is Teagasc, as some of you might know, is Ireland's semi-state farm advisory and research body. So they have multiple offices nationwide and multiple research centres nationwide. Some of you might have heard of Moore Park, which is the dairy hub for, it's basically all things dairy in relation to advisory in Ireland. So that's where they do all their research. Teagasc put forward ideas in relation to how they'd like to improve their advisory service, and basically master's programs are based off of them. So I put my name forward for this master's program. I like the idea of the technology and automation, so I put my name forward for it, and that's how I got involved. So as Nico also says, I'm working with Lely Centre Mullingburgh as a farm management support advisor. So as a farm management support advisor, what we do is it's basically everything related to the cow management. So in Ireland, we're dealing with primarily grazing farms. So we've over 300 robots in our Lely Centre. So we're trying to manage the cows. The grazing is a particular issue, I suppose, and that if they can maximise the grazing, the system generally tends to work very well. And also looking at utilising the technology as best we can. So for today, the purpose of this presentation is based on my study. How can agricultural extension services support Irish dairy farmers using automated milking systems? And the idea was put forward by Patrick Owen of Teagasc, who is an expansion specialist, and he also has 3 Lely astronauts on his own home farm, and Dr. Bridget Lynch, who is a researcher and lecturer in the University College Dublin. So really just to put a bit of a background on why this study was important in an Irish context. As you're all aware, automatic milking systems offer a change in strategy to deal with challenges in the dairy industry, such as fragmentation and labour shortage and the efficiency of labour. In Ireland, I suppose these are very, very relevant issues. The fragmentation issue probably is one that gets brushed under the carpet a small bit, but 40% of most Irish farms have land away from the main milking platform. On average, most Irish farms have 3.5 blocks of land. And then to compound that, only about 0.2% of the land base in Ireland comes up for sale every year. So it's very, very hard to extend your milking platform or extend your milking base around your home farm, more importantly. And on top of all that, then labour has become a major issue on Irish farms. So In general, studies have shown that the milking process would take approximately 25 to 35% of the day for 300 days of the year plus. In an Irish example, AMS has shown to reduce the need for labour by about 36%. Now, studies have varied about worldwide in relation to this, but the average would sit somewhere around 21% in a reduction. The reason it's a small bit higher in Ireland is because of the grass-based diet. However, when you do move to an AMS system from a conventional system, you would see a threefold increase in the management of grass. So the grass becomes even more of a pillar in the success of the system. So obviously, I've just said, AMS is a different way of life. It offers that extra flexibility to farmers, and then also it offers much more data in relation to cow performance and cow management. So it's the role of the farmer changes. It turns into a role of interpreting the data that the computer gives you and then consciously making decisions based on that. As regards Teagasc and their advisory service, they have a dairy business and technology program, which is designed to improve farmer profitability and also the lifestyle through a number of different measures. So these measures include breeding plans, grassland management, efficiency of labour, and generally just improving the farmer's lifestyle. There is a serious demand for labour, as I just said, on Irish dairy farms since the abolition of the milk quota in 2015. So Teagasc released studies which indicated that roughly 6,000 people were going to be required between 2017 and 2025, assuming 30 hours per cow per year. So that's an extraordinary number of people to be required in a small industry in a small country. So really what this was looking at was the average herd size in Ireland was expected to increase to over 100 cows per herd by 2025. There's expected to be 1.7 million cows in Ireland by 2025. Currently, there's somewhere around 1.4. Now, obviously, this all assumes that there are no environmental impacts and no changes in relation to greenhouse gases, because I'm not sure what the case is in Australia, but here in Ireland, farming seems to be getting a bit of a bashing lately in relation to the environment. So these figures could be up for debate going forward. But as of now, it's expected that there would be about 1.7 million cows in Ireland, dairy cows in Ireland in 2025. So really, what this all said was that farmers need to maximise the efficiency of cows to strengthen their own place in the industry. And there are obviously going to be a number of challenges in doing this, and technology can be one way to overcome some of these challenges. And AMS is obviously a very obvious technology in that, but it does need a different approach. So this research aimed to quantify what exactly is a little bit different about it, and how going forward could we get the extension services to adjust their ways and means of giving out advice and facilitating advice. So to summarise, the objectives of the study were to evaluate the level of extension services used by farmers when adapting and using AMS technology. So where did they seek their advice when using the technology? And furthermore, to evaluate the current advisory program and advisor training in relation to AMS. So what is the advisor's knowledge base like? And would they consider themselves competent in AMS? And then to fully conclude, to produce guidelines for the development of extension services for AMS clients. So to detail a set of recommendations for Teagasc to implement going forward using the data that I gathered from this research. Okay, so the study methodology really was probably the first, not stumbling block, but the first issue we had to overcome. Really, with robotics in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, the main hub was in the Midlands. Now that was probably primarily due to Lely Centre Mullingar, which was based in the Midlands in Ireland. But overall, at the time of the study, there were around 600 AMS farmers nationwide, north and south of the border. So that's Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, with roughly 70% grazing and 30% confined or zero grazing systems. So to call them confined and zero grazing systems, we decided that 50% of their diet should be coming from indoors, not from grazing pasture, if they were to be considered confined, because that was just the cut-off point that we had made and other studies had made, so we used a similar cut-off point. The reason we picked existing AMS farmers and also new entrant AMS farmers was to see how had the system progressed over the past 3 to 4 years. So the existing AMS farmers were in 3, 4, maybe 5 years, whereas the new entrants were only in less than a year. So it was to see had the system, had the advice changed in 3 or 4 years, or had it progressed itself, even though there had been very little done with the extension service. So the region that was selected for the study was the Border Midlands in the west of Ireland, which we call the BMW region. Lely Centre Mullingar is placed right in the middle of that star there. That's where the vast majority of robots were sold, and that's very variable, but we have heard were implemented in the early days. Now, what we've seen in the last 2 years is that expansion has rocketed out past that star, really. Like the level of robots that are being installed last year at the back end of 2019 and also moving forward this year and into 2021 is really staggering. We had installed roughly 70 robots from last October up until this February. So like the number of robots in our centre alone is improving and increasing day in, day out. So what the methodology that was decided we'd use would be conduct 14 semi-structured interviews. We didn't decide 14 day one, but we did 12 originally, and then we're at saturation at that point as regards data, because basically at saturation is the same thing was being said over and over again. So I did 2 more along with the 12 just to double down on it, and we did a split of 70% grazing and 30% confined and 0 grazing. And then to finish off, we did a focus group with 8 dairy advisors in the region. So that was basically to see what was their opinion on the whole system and the training they'd been given and how comfortable were they on the system. So to kick off the research, what I did was we asked the farmers why did they pick AMS, and no real surprise with the 4 reasons they gave. The first was off-farm employment. So of the 14 farmers, 11 of them had off-farm employment in some shape or form. That varied from 8 hours a week up to a full 40 hours a week. So 40 hours a week would be full-time employment with us here in Ireland. The robot allowed them to have that off-farm employment, with some farmers remarking that they'd rather manage the robots than have to manage employees on the farm. They reckoned that there would be less variables in managing technology rather than managing people and human resource management. The second was the lack of available labour. As I've already said, there was going to be a strong labour demand on the Irish dairy industry going forward up in these years and moving forward. In some areas, there was a lack of good labour available. Half of the farmers saw this as the biggest challenge, but also saw AMS as a major advantage in trying to counteract this problem. So it would also be easier to get a relief worker for the weekends to manage an AMS system rather than getting a relief worker to do 4 milkings over the weekend. So 2 in the morning on 2 in the mornings and 2 in the evenings on Saturday and Sunday. So they figured it would be way easier to get people to work for them by having the AMS system installed. And then a really important reason was also the lifestyle, the health, and the appeal to future generations. So what I mean by that is it is not as daunting going forward for future generations to be inheriting a system.
Might vary depending on.
They were inheriting a system where they had to stand in the parlour for multiple hours in the morning and the evening for 300 days of the year. There's a lot of pressure. It mightn't be exactly what you want to do, whereas it could be a lot easier to manage the robots going forward. Yeah, that was said previously as well, fragmentation. Farmers were looking to maximise the output on their own land base overall, not just trying to maximise the output on the land around the actual farm or around the actual home farm. Some participants, so there was 2 participants in the study, had a robot on an outblock. So basically, they were of the opinion that we can put in the robot, we can go there 2 or 3 times a day max, but the robot will generally look after itself there, and the farm will look after itself, and I would have more bang for my buck really, rather than having that as an out farm where you'd have dry stock or be leaving your heifers or cutting silage. So then we asked the participants, what did they use Teagasc for? What did they use the extension service for? This varied substantially. 3 farmers didn't use Teagasc at all. They sought advice from private advisors or didn't get advice from anyone at all. 3 farmers use Teagasc for scheme work only. So what we call scheme work would be applying for European Union grants and aids, doing your nitrogen derogations. So we have issue with nitrogen here as regards derogations and stocking rates. That would be especially relevant with dairy farmers in Ireland. And then also doing business plans. So to apply to the bank for money to invest in the system, you need to have a business plan, and you need to have something you can stand over for the next 5 to 7 years as regards finance. Along with that, probably the most positive thing that farmers were getting from the Teagasc Extension Service was their discussion groups. Now, these discussion groups were with conventional dairy farmers, not AMS only discussion groups. So there was conventional dairy discussion groups, and then most of the farmers would have been the only AMS farmer in the group. So these discussion groups, I'll be getting into a small bit more detail in the next slide or two, but really the focus of what the farmers were telling us in the interviews were that the advisors had a low number of clients that were AMS farmers. So there was low levels of AMS farmers on their client base, which by default meant then in some shape or knowledge level amongst advisors. It was a kind of a two-way street. The farmers weren't confident in the advisors, and the advisors weren't confident in what they could give to the farmers. So really, it was a damning report, and it probably wasn't really that accurate. But the advisors had it in their head that they didn't know much about the system, and by default, then that took away the confidence of the farmers in the advisors. So just 2 quotes that I pulled out from the research yesterday when I was looking over it was, my advisor told me that he didn't know enough about robots, and my advisor would openly admit he had no clue about how the system would work. So like, it was the most decisive theme of the study that it was an unequivocally opinionated lack of knowledge on the advisor's behalf. And farmers knew that the AMS was in its infancy, so they didn't expect the advisors to know much about the system, but they did expect them to know a certain amount, and they didn't want to get advice off someone that wasn't confident on it. And I suppose the 2 main issues in the advisor's lack of knowledge were the cow movement and the grassland management. So for anyone that is aware of AMS systems and specifically on a grazing system, cow movement and grassland management go hand in hand. The grass drives the cow movement, and the cow movement is the indicator of the grassland management. So if you can't get your cows to graze the right covers, well then the system isn't going to work, because the cows will move, the cows will sit down, they won't come in to be grazed. So really the advisors just couldn't hadn't their heads got around it, this system. It was just really, it was a lack of training, I suppose. The knowledge the advisors had was all there on overall cow management in a dairy herd. So they would be able to tell you everything in relation to cow management on a conventional dairy herd, and they could tell you the grass management of a conventional dairy herd. The only difference was that dividing it up between 3 blocks that we perceive to be the A, the B, and the C, the advisors hadn't got their heads around it. And along with that, the management of it. So they might be able to tell you the times, like A, B, and C times, what times the cows will go to them, but they wouldn't be able to elaborate on how we'd maximize the system. And to the farmers, that was probably the most important part. They needed someone that they could bounce ideas off about trying to maximize the system when they couldn't get through to Lely, or they couldn't get through to some of their other peers. So this was the most damning theme of the research. The advisors weren't confident on it, and the farmers weren't confident to go to the advisors. But one overall positive of the Teagasc service was the discussion groups. So it's no real surprise either, because discussion groups worldwide are a really good tool for the dissemination of ideas. And just a few quotes from the farmers, it keeps me alert to what other conventional dairy farmers are doing. And every time you get to one you learn from one of the rest of the lads. So again, it's no real surprise. They could learn things such as the feeding rates from conventional herds. There's no major difference between that and AMS. Grass growth rates and the managing of grass. Although there are slight differences in relation to how you allocate grass, the myth that AMS is harder is exactly that. It's a mix. It's just a little bit different in management, but all the principles remain the same. You need good infrastructure, you need good waterways, you need to keep your reseeding right, you need to keep your nutrients right in the ground, your fertility. And other things such as the breeding tips for the overall herd, the herd health management, and your seasonal jobs, such as, like I've just said, such as reseeding and that. So there was definitely things that the farmers could pick up from the conventional discussion groups. But along with that, the conventional discussion groups did have some limitations, as not all things were applicable. So farmers, the AMS farmers did acknowledge that there was some things that weren't applicable, such as 36-hour grazings per paddock, and talking about how to save time in relation to parlour tasks. But that was obviously going to happen, given that they were running a different system. So where did the farmers, the AMS farmers, seek their technical advice if they weren't seeking it off of Teagasc advisors? So the biggest one was peer learning. So there was a lot of peer-to-peer learning. Basically, what this included was a WhatsApp group that Lely have for the area. So there are over 200 participants in a WhatsApp group that Lely have for the Border Midlands and the West region. This includes farmers, farm management support advisors, and also Lely engineers. So the farmers remarked that there was friendships formed from the WhatsApp group alone by figuring out who was close to me, who was in my area, who was running a similar system to me, and who was trying to do what I'm trying to do. And what they figured out was, by Lely hooking them up with each other, they actually ended up forming friendships and doing their own thing based on that. So it was all really peer learning. And Lely, along with that, then would have the farm management support advisors, which is the role I'm currently in at the moment. So basically, the farm management support advisors will give them the day-to-day advice on maximising the information that the system is giving them. So helping them look at their dashboards and helping them make decisions based on the data. Some farmers remarked that they were only using 60 to 70% of the data, but with the help of the daily farm management support advisors and also relation to help from their peers, that they were maximising up near 90 or 100% of the data that they taught. So one farmer remarked, Lely are always only a phone call away. And along with that, their peers were always only a phone call away. So the more robots that were going into an area, the more the farmers thought they were learning from each other, because there was always more help as regards relief. There was always help in relation to how do I get the cows to do X, Y, or Z. It's the more they went in, the more saturated it was, and the more everyone was learning from it. So then, after the interviews of the farmers had taken place, what I did was I gathered all the data. I got together with my two supervisors and we sectioned it out. And what we did was I prepared a presentation of the findings and presented it to a focus group of 8 dairy advisors from the region that were dealing with these farmers. So the idea was we'd present them with the findings, we'd ask for their opinions on it and what they thought, and we'd ask for them to help shape the guidelines for the extension services by seeing how comfortable they are with the system. The first thing that the advisors remarked was that their attitude to the group in relation to robotics was extremely positive, that Teagasc should be providing an impartial, neutral opinion, and they saw AMS as a vital cog to help counteract the issues in the dairy industry as previously discussed. They also remarked that the system does work, so the advisors should know how to attempt to maximise the system and help to give advice on it, and also not to get too hung up on it, that the basic principles of good dairy farming still apply to robotic milking. It's just a case of tweaking them slightly to make sure that you can maximise the system. But there was definitely an acknowledgement that the knowledge level on AMS is low, so they weren't confident to give advice on the system, and they needed to improve the understanding of the system ASAP. And really, they felt that they were going to lose the respect of this cohort of farmers if they didn't improve their knowledge on the system as soon as possible. And the Teagasc in general has a great reputation in relation to dairy farming and has done so much in relation to the dairy industry in Ireland that it would be a pity to lose one subsection of that purely based on not having the training done. So they also reiterated the fact that the cow movement and understanding the computer dashboard are the 2 areas of most concern for advisors. So again, that was reiterating what the farmers have said. And that it looked terrible to say that the farmers were getting no technical advice in relation to their system. The advisors did dispute that they were giving them the advice. They were giving the farmers the advice, but the farmers just didn't recognise it. And again, that the basics are the same on a conventional system versus AMS, but you just have to tweak it slightly. And then another finding that we got from the focus group of the dairy advisors was that the popularity levels amongst clients and new dairy entrants is high. So that up to half of new entrants in certain counties in Ireland were installing AMS systems. And the reasons for this were the younger generations wouldn't do what the older generations would have done. So new entrants were open-minded, liked technology, and could see this system working going forward. So the Teagasc advisors felt that if they could give an impartial opinion on this, but an informed impartial opinion, that they would put themselves in the best possible place going forward to advise these clients when they do become dairy farmers. So that if they had given them all the information they could before they got into dairy farming, that the clients would use them as a resource and would help them, and the advisors would be able to help them. There would be a good relationship built up from early in the days in relation to dairy farming. So having done all this, we sat down and we put together what we thought would be the best set of recommendations. Now, there was one thing that stuck out to us the most. This was the use of discussion groups. Obviously, like I said, the farmers had remarked that the discussion groups, the conventional discussion groups, were the best. So we figured an AMS discussion group going forward would be even better again. So one focused on dairy farming, but specifically AMS. Now, what actually happened was there was one of these was trialled up in Monaghan and Cavan, which would be the northern end of the Republic.
Engaging the top 10%.
Be very successful for the first year. There was a good complement to the conventional discussion group. So the same things were discussed in the AMS group as the conventional discussion group, but then there was also the added bonus of being able to discuss things such as milkings per cow per day, the failure rates, the refusals, all these different technical terms that conventional farmers wouldn't be used to discussing. It was the added bonus. And then also the cow movement and the grass management. And what the advisors found was the more they brought the farmers together, the more the advisors were learning. So the best way for the advisors to learn was to be on farm with the AMS farmers to learn. And by bringing in guest speakers to make sure that the best knowledge was being disseminated during these discussion groups. Along with that, to keep the thing linked up between the discussion groups, the introduction of WhatsApp groups or messaging groups in relation to AMS. So the farmers could interact with each other on a regular basis, and the advisors could put questions to the farmers on a regular basis. So again, just to keep everyone on the one page, to make sure that the advisors are learning as much as possible going forward, and that the system of having the discussion groups is not just lost. So a discussion group is fine, but some discussion groups might only meet 6 or 7 times a year. But in the intermittent period between them, it will be important to have a contact base for all the farmers to make sure they're all on the one page, and that the advisors will be continuously learning. And then a major point was to improve advisor in-service training. So by in-service training, that's the advisors train once a month for a day, usually in Moore Park, or could generally be a different centre across Ireland, depending on where the advisors are from. So the advisors wanted to up their knowledge level, and if they up their knowledge level, they would increase their confidence on the system. It would increase the overall image Teagasc has towards AMS farming, and people will then come to them for advice, and they would be potential leaders in the automatic milking industry going forward. So the advisor training was probably the final cog that would complete it. It would be a rounded approach. The AMS discussion groups would probably be the first thing that would kick off. But for them to succeed fully, the advisors would have to be trained up. And the only way they would get trained up would be through in-service training and continuous contact with experts and farmers in the field. So, Nico, that's actually about the size of my presentation. I hope I didn't confuse anyone too much. And I tried to keep it as short as possible, as I'm aware it's very text-based, so I didn't want to do too much. And I put it back to you, just if there are any questions anyone has in relation to the study, or in relation to grazing with robots, or anything in relation to my job, I'm more than happy to answer.
Excellent, Philip. Thank you very much for your time. I think there's been a lot of valuable insights throughout that presentation, so thank you for that one. There's been a couple of questions come through.
Yep.
Let me open it. The first one is, what's the average general KPI of the grazing AMS herds you work with, particularly in relation to milk yield and milking frequency?
Okay, so as regards milking frequency, if we could get the robots to sit, if we could get the cows to sit somewhere around the 2 milkings to the 2.2 milking mark at this time of year, we'd be happy. It probably depends really on what you're trying to maximize out of the system. Really, like we'd have some farmers that would have up near 80 cows on the robot, so they wouldn't be getting the milking frequency compared to the farmers that might only have 60 cows on the robot. So it's kind of an open-ended question in that regard. The milking frequency at this time of year on the spring calving herd will probably be at its highest, given the fact that we're trying to get the most out of the cows and they're hitting peak at this time of year. As regards yield, again, that's very variable, but we'd have grazing herds that would be well up towards the 30 litre mark, over the 30 litre mark. But then obviously we prepare herds which would be a lot lower than that. So I'm not trying to give back the answer without answering the question, but it's a very variable thing depending on the system you're trying to install. But if you could sit somewhere around the 2.2 mark for milkings per day at the moment, you'd be doing just fine, or a little lower even, depending on how many cows you had in the system.
This is a question from me, but from work we've done here, we've seen that kind of the physical parameter that relates more to profitability and that makes AMS more profitable is amount of milk harvested per robot. And therefore, there's discussions on how farmers can maximize that amount of milk harvested per robot. Is that something that is discussed also in Ireland or that farmers are looking at? And then the way they achieve that might vary depending on kind of what farm system you have or cow breed or whatever?
Yeah, that would definitely be something that we'd be looking at with our the farmers that will be settled on the system maybe a year or two. So really the crux to all of that with us is the cow movement, because if the cows aren't moving for 24 hours of the day, well then we can't max the output per robot. So if the cows don't milk for the hours in the middle of the night, well then to us you're not maximizing the system. So that's why the grass is so important to us here. If we can keep the grass right and get the cows moving right from day one, we'll max the output per robot on the system. And then obviously breeding comes into that then in some shape or form, given that here in Ireland we're paid on our solids, so we're paid for fat and protein and our minus water. So that's really the crux for the whole thing, and that's why we always repeat it as farm management board advisors, is if we can get the grass right and we can get the cow movement right, well then the output per robot will look after itself once the breeding is right as well. So it's kind of, it's a two-way street really, in the fact that it will all go okay as regards output per robot, but to do that you have to have the grass right, because you won't get maximize the system for 24 hours a day. It's not like the barn system where they're max going to be 100 meters away from it, given the size of the barn. Like we would have cows traveling up near 1.5 kilometers to 2 kilometers to get milked. So to do that, they need to have the grass right in front of them.
Yeah, it's like the chicken and the egg. What comes first that explains
Yeah,
how do
you could argue it either way really, but the grass is really the fundamentals of the whole thing, and we that's our constant message to all our farmers, is to get that right.
Excellent. There's another question is, do you think Teagasc should start a special AMS advisory service in your opinion?
I don't think there'd be need for it, because at the same time there's still a small proportion of farmers in Ireland are AMS farmers. So it's maybe one thing going forward would be to have an AMS specialist, but that was put to the advisors, would an AMS specialist be a good idea? And most of the advisors actually were against it, because they felt if they had an AMS specialist, that they would fob off the responsibility themselves as advisors, that they would put it back to the specialist every time, and they would never end up learning about the system. And then there would come a day where one specialist wouldn't be enough, and it would probably be all heaped back on the advisors again, and they would have no knowledge. So going forward, they said it should be just treated the very same as a conventional system or once a day system or whatever farmers are implementing, that they should have an equal level of knowledge on it and try improve on it every year to maximize it in some shape or form.
Do you see there's other players that are coming into that game? Like, are they private advisors or consultants looking at working in that space? Because at the moment it appears that Teagasc is doing something, but obviously not to the level of expertise, given that they cover different systems and everything. And obviously the commercial companies are covering that gap up to a certain extent. Are there certain private advisors looking at filling in that gap?
No, there doesn't appear to be really any private advisors. Really, all we would see, even just in the role I'm in at the moment as farm management support, would be feed advisors and nutritionists. They would really be the only gap in the system. But what they're doing really is really more for the indoor herds rather than the grazing herds. The grazing herds, that's probably where the biggest gap is. There's no one filling, like you said, there's no one really filling the gap that the advisory service is leaving behind them. We, as farm management support, are filling our side of the gap. But when it comes to the smaller things that you'd be expecting from the advisory service, they're just at the moment that's where they're catching up and they're going to tap into it. But at the moment, what we have as farm management support advisors is we've started to run more discussion groups nationwide. So we'd run a week of discussion groups now. And obviously, at the moment we can't do it with COVID-19, but what we do is we run discussion groups just to keep everyone intact and everyone on the one page as regards grazing. But there will be no private outside of the milking companies or Teagasc giving any advice that I'm aware of anyway.
Excellent. There's another one that says, what are some practical ways that you have found in Ireland of engaging the top 10% and or the more experienced robots with consultants and researchers in order to continue to grow the knowledge base within the industry?
Okay, well, one thing we do to actually engage all our farmers, even just from a Lely point of view, is we have this thing called a leaderboard once a month. So all farmers know their own code. Now there's no names on the leaderboard, but everyone knows their own code. So the farmers are benchmarking against each other. So there's always a constant progression to move up the system, to move up the leaderboard, to see who's producing the best per robot and is keeping failures to a minimum and all the likes of that. As regards engaging with the industry, it's hard to know. We haven't. There doesn't really be that much in relation to the actual specifics of robots and the dairy industry. We as Lely would have some excellent farmers that would be well within the top 10% of the Irish dairy industry. But these are focused on your solids per cow, etc., and focused on the basic grassland tasks that would be the same as any conventional herd. So as an industry to look at it, they'd be more looking at it just as dairy farming rather than actually just AMS farming. There's not two sides to that. It's all just comes under the bracket of dairy farming, and well and good then if your farm is an AMS farm. It's not. There will be no real divide in engaging the top 10% of AMS or engaging the top 10% of conventional dairy farming. It kind of all comes under the one bracket, and it's just whatever system you happen to have.
Yeah, I guess that question also comes from an angle of what we've seen here is that discussion groups are really good.
Yeah.
But at certain stage, kind of the top farmers or the farmers that have been doing it for a while, there might be a feeling that they're kind of continuously training the new farmers, the ones that start, and we need to find a spot that also taps into their needs, and how do we kind of keep them engaged and answering the questions that they might have, recognizing that it's also important to have them on board because they have years of experience that can be of benefit not only to the new farmers, but also to the industry as a whole? And I guess it is a challenge.
Yeah, yeah. Like what we would find with the tool we use of the leaderboard, and we've lately have this software called Benchmark. Like, it is a really good indicator of where you are at with your cows and what your robots are doing and what they're capable of being pushed forward to. So obviously none of your data is given to any other farmers without your permission, but there are farmers that are on the system maybe 5, 6, 7 years, and we would get them once a week to look at where they are versus where people running the similar system for the same length of time with a similar cow type are at that time as well. And it's kind of a little, it is that pick me up that they would need if there was ever a doubt that they weren't maximizing the system. And then to add in on that top of that, I get your point that the farmers mightn't be getting perceived to be getting much out of the discussion groups if they're existing, but we haven't come across that yet. Most of our discussion groups would have a lot of experience and a lot of new farmers, and generally the way, because AMS is in its general relative infancy here in Ireland, they're kind of starting to come in clusters now, that there's probably 1 or 2 experienced in the area and 1 or 3 or 4 new entrants. And so far, so good in relation to everyone seems to be all on board for sharing as much advice as possible, because going forward, the better the system can be ran, it's better for everyone. So the more you can pick up, even the new entrants would have lots to tell the existing people in relation to how to get a little bit more out of the system, because you can often find the new entrants can bring something completely new to the game that mightn't have been picked up, and can disseminate that with the rest of the group. So to be honest, I think the discussion groups going forward are going to be our main focus as regards Lely and as regards Teagasc, because they are the best way to disseminate knowledge with the least amount of work, the best bang for your buck, so to speak. You are getting the most out of having a group of 10 to 12 or 14 farmers all in the one area doing the same thing and trying to maximize it.
Excellent. Then there's another question. You mentioned 4 reasons to invest or to look at AMS. Surprising, nobody mentioned production, an increase in production, or an increase in profits.
Yeah, it probably wasn't something we didn't get into the finance side of it. It was something we consciously did avoid in relation to the research, because this was more seen as a kind a social and an advisory experiment, rather than there are financial experiments that have gone on, and studies have shown in Teagasc that the extra, again, bang for your buck in relation to having the system and what it can carry versus what a conventional 12 or 14 unit parlour can carry, and the cost related to it, all that costings and all that has been done in relation to AMS on grazing systems in Ireland. It was something we consciously avoided, was asking questions on profit. Like, lots of farmers would have remarked the extra data that they're getting for their cows and trying to interpret it, but we wouldn't have seen it as a key finding to the study, because we knew it was already a major player with AMS. Like, most papers you read in relation to AMS would tell you that you're getting the extra data in relation to it, and that you can potentially get more out of your cows if you manage them right. But that wasn't what we were looking to get out of it. We were looking at more the social. Most papers you read in relation to AMS and what the farmers were looking to get out of it from an advisory point of view, outside of the profitability side of it. It was that might sound a little bit confusing, but it was something that we kind of consciously avoided, because the profitability wasn't something we wanted to get into.
No, that makes sense from the point of view of the angle that you took for it. So I think
Yeah,
it's reasonable.
it was just the angle of the study that was the primary reason for it.
Perfect. There's another question is, did farmers, particularly the ones that were already operating with AMS, provide any insight into what would they do differently if they had to do it again?
They did provide insight. Most would have remarked that they didn't really have any objections with what they had done, or that they wouldn't change a whole pile. Some would have remarked that they'd like to have maybe done a small bit more research on which system they'd implement. So whether it be full-time grazing. So, for example, a farmer that has 60 or 70 acres of ground. Would it be best for that farmer to put 70 cows on it with one robot, or would it be best to try and maximise that piece of ground with 130 or 40 cows, and then also be complementing the grass with half the diet inside? So a lot of farmers went in with the vision of, because I have 50 or 60 acres, all I can do is carry one robot, and they mightn't have put the infrastructure in place, or they mightn't have put the sheds in place, and would maybe cost a little bit more now to do it, and it's probably not feasible at this stage. Whereas that would be probably the only thing farmers would have looked at. Other than that, most would have done their own research. Most would have gone to other robotic farmers, gone to all different types, so like Lely, De Laval, Fullwood, Gia, any of them, looked at it. But at the end of the day, the basic principles of the system remain the same, regardless of what colour the robot is. The basic principles remain the same. So once farmers were seeing that on a continuous basis in other places, they were able to know going forward. The more experienced ones probably took more of a chance, given that there wasn't as many farmers at the time with robotic systems, and they had to travel further distances in the country to see systems that were working. But some of our best farmers are some of the farmers in it the longest, so they were still going well at the time, so they would have been a good indicator going forward for those farmers anyway.
Excellent. There's two more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem at all.
It means that it was really interesting because there's a lot of questions coming through. From your experience working with AMS farmers, what are the main pain points during the transition period and the first 12 months? And do you see farmers change any farm practice when moving to AMS? Example, calving pattern?
Well, to answer that, the second part of that question, in Ireland, if you're going to run a grazing system, the vast majority of your cows are probably going to calve down in the springtime, given the fact that you want to follow the grass growth curve. That's what we always try. The most money can be made based on following the grass growth curve in Ireland. So the calving pattern generally wouldn't change. You might see some indoor people would extend out their calving pattern into blocks or else scattered across the year to share out to. Would it be best for that farmer if you're on a grazing system? Really, unless you have a winter milk contract, the most money will be made from the spring calving. Now, there are obviously farmers that are trying to maximise the robot for 365 days of the year. To do that, you will have to calve a little bit out of season. So you will be calving at the back end a small bit. But in general, most of our farmers would be sitting with 100% spring calving, with some farmers then obviously having winter contracts. But as regards changing practices and getting into the system, the biggest stumbling block we would find is if a farmer was coming from a conventional parlour to a robot, trying to train those farmers into the new practices. So the practices of staying away from the herd, breaking up the herd to make sure that the cows are doing what they want in 2s and 3s and 4s rather than the whole 60 or 70 all coming in together. It's a lot of the issue can be just training the farmers. And once the farmers are trained and they figure out their new routine and get the cows working to that routine, well, then everything works out fine. But what you can find is if there's a small bit of disconnect and it doesn't work properly from day one, it can take a little bit more to tweak the system to get it back to working to perfection. What we would find is that's why we would always try to be there. We would try to be on farm as Lely as much as possible for the first week to try get the good habits up and running from day one and knock away any of the old habits from the existing herd. As regards new entrants and people that would have no experience, they're probably the easiest to deal with, given the fact that they would have no experience with conventional parlours. So there's no real habits to be broken. Most would have done their own research. Most would have listened to what am I looking out for, what are the KPIs I'm looking for to ensure that I'm maximising the system. Every farm is different. We'd see that day in, day out. Like I said, we had 70 robots were installed between October, November and March of this year. Included in that was a whole variance. Some people converting from tillage, some people from beef or sheep farming, some that were already dairy farmers, some that were coming back into the dairy in the first time in 10 years, 20 years, whatever it would be. So in that, there's obviously going to be variation in regards to how you have to train them and how those farmers are going to react to the system. But in general, sitting now 2 or 3 months on, all those farmers are working a relatively similar routine, and it just took some maybe a little while longer to get going on it, given the system they were running.
Excellent. And what about the main pain points during the transition in first 12 months?
So, as in the main stumbling blocks?
Yeah, for farmers,
Or,
like what do they struggle with? Is it more car traffic?
yeah,
Is it more?
so it would probably be the grassland management would be the biggest one that they'd probably fear, and not understanding what to do. But what we would say is, you don't need to know much about it before you start. It's when you start, then that's when you learn the most. A day or two of allocating grass and with the cows moving right will tell you whether the thing is working right or wrong. The cows will be the indicator. So, like you said, the cow traffic and the cow movement is probably the biggest stumbling block. And seeing cows stand on a lane for maybe 20 minutes or a half an hour, she could just be standing there looking over the ditch. But there's nothing wrong with that. The point I would always make to farmers is, if they were in a conventional herd, the cows would probably be standing in a holding yard for 2 hours before milking, in the morning and in the evening, and potentially after milking. So there'd be no issue with them standing around at that stage. So with the grazing, you have to be open to the fact that the cows are going to do their own thing and might stand in a spot where you mightn't want her to stand. But if she's comfortable standing there and there's nothing bothering her, then she's fine. That would probably be the biggest stumbling block we've had with farmers. But once the farmers figure out that the grass drives everything, and once you have the grass right and are sure you have the grass right, well, then you just have to trust the system to work, and it will work in relation to the management of cows.
Yeah, and there's a comment here around, given that homegrown forage is one of the best measures of profitability within conventional milking, and we would assume the same is the case with robotic milking. There should be a lot of work in that area to ensure
Yeah,
that robotic milking is not compromising this potential profitability at all, and therefore research and extension consultancy should be directed to this. And I would definitely agree with that comment.
yeah, like that's the main driver of profit on spring calving herds in Ireland is the grassland management, and if that can be maximised, whether it's a robot or a conventional herd, it is the same goal you're getting at. So it's the same thing we're all trying to achieve. It's just we do it slightly different given the system that we're running and what we're trying to do, but it is the same. The forage is the big driver, and the cheapest forage we have is grass.
Yeah, and I guess probably the added, I'd say, advantage, but difference also with conventional milking is that with robotic milking, you get that indirect measurement of how well you allocate pasture by looking at cow traffic and visitation pattern to the dairy. So
Yeah,
you can kind of guess if you're getting it right or wrong by looking at
yeah,
cow traffic.
and it's very easy to adjust as well. Like, it's not as if one mistake today will lead to a week's hardship in relation to cow movements. Like, farmers are always going to get it a small bit wrong from time to time. Like, and that's one thing we would say to the farmers is, don't be too hard on yourself in relation to it,
Yeah,
because at the end of the day, the first year or two, you're not looking to maximize the system, because you're looking to transition into it and figure out what cows work, what cows don't work, where am I as regards seasonally, what is the best way to rotate my grazing platform to keep cow movement up to its maximum. So basically, that's what we use the year one to do, is train them in to get their eye in for the grass as best as possible, but be aware that they're going to make mistakes, because it's a seasonal game. It's weather dependent, climate dependent, and cow dependent. So there are so many variables in there that there are going to be mistakes along the way.
definitely. Do most farmers, would you say that most farmers in Ireland measure pasture availability? Or is it
That,
just kind of visual
yeah,
assessment?
that's actually one thing we're looking at the moment. Really, is about 20% of our um, client base in Lely, Mullingar, measure grass at the moment. So that's 20% of our robotic base. Overall in Ireland, I think it sits somewhere around 10% dairy farmers are measuring grass, or 10% of farmers are measuring grass. So it's something that the top 10% are using to maximize their system even more. But it's probably something by default that AMS farmers are doing, because they are continuously walking their paddocks to change wires and to figure out where they're going next daily. They are really measuring, but what we get them to do is, if they're not comfortable putting a number, a 1400 kilo cover on it, or putting a number on it, we just get them to split it into low, medium and high. And if they can do that and stay going into your medium cover, that's a certain height up your Wellington or your boot, well then you are essentially measuring grass. You're just not doing it with a number. So if we can start them at that, we
it's a
generally find
subjective measurement.
we just get them to transition onto it then after. And we've seen that. Even we have a system here called Pasture Base. It's a Teagasc initiative. Teagasc have a big initiative called Grass 10, which is related to grassland management and maximising utilisations. And there's a big push on grassland management in Ireland. And the big crux of that is Pasture Base, which is where we record all our data. And more of our farmers in Daly are starting to use that as the time goes by.
Are you seeing things like, I don't know, drones, satellites, plate meters, like things like that being used on farm?
Wouldn't see too much of drones or satellites, because our farms generally wouldn't be overly, would be as big in scale as some of the farms you'd have out there. But really what the farmers will be using is walking back down as far as the quadrant and shears will be probably the main one we'd use, and then a plate meter in some places would be. It's really what we would try to do with farmers is get them to start with the Wellington or the boot, and then transition to maybe the plate meter, or transition them maybe to the quadrant and shears, and then based on how comfortable they are, well then it'll be up to them to push forward. So if they want to go with a plate meter or some other, a grasshopper or some other system like that. But if we can get them in tune with the low, medium and high, and a constant rotation and keeping it in their head, well, that's half the battle. And then they can maximize the system going forward based on their own knowledge.
Excellent. Just a last open-ended question. Well, what do you think we haven't solved for pasture-based robotic milking yet? Like, what remains, either the research question or the thing that is still an issue for pasture-based AMS, if there is any?
Ooh, that's a tricky one now. God, like I don't think there's too much, because like I think often the biggest problem, I think, in a lot of places is the overthinking of it. Like people are overthinking the workload that's involved with AMS in relation to grass. I think if you can keep the basic principles the same, and with the aim of trying to maximize your cow movement at night, and probably farms will vary in relation to cow movement based on geography and things like that as well. So I don't think there's really any major hole in relation to grazing data. It's kind of, if we can just merge all of our pasture data and our grassland data that we have from our research centres and merge them into where it fits into the AMS system. But I wouldn't say there's a major hole in relation to it or any gap that needs to be filled.
Excellent, Philip. Look, obviously it's been an hour of presentation and long questions and discussions. So obviously there was a lot of interest there. I do want to thank you once again for your time and for accepting this invitation and this opportunity to share not only your research, but also all your experience with robotic milking in Ireland. So thank you very much for all that.
No problem at all, Sally. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
No worries. So for all of you on the line, if you want to follow or join our initiatives, we've got the New South Wales DPI Dairy Facebook page that you can follow, and we release a newsletter 4 times a year. The link to both of them is in the screen, and you should have received it when you registered, and you will receive a reminder.
Habits from the existing herd.
But once again, thank you all for joining today. If you want more information, please visit the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries website. There's a dairy section in there where you will be able to access a lot of tools and resources and material that we produce, and you will be able to access a recording of this webinar. So thank you very much, all of you, for attending, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.